First of all, I want to start out by saying, as you now know, we have arrested the suspect that I referred to late last week as a serial murderer and sexual assault suspect. I want to thank a few people first before we get into some details. I must thank the Detroit Police Department, both our homicide and special victims unit, who clearly just worked so tirelessly in trying to bring some closure for the family members of these victims. And while we are still actively investigating, they are still very much involved in bringing some closure to this case. I want to also thank the Michigan State Police Crime Lab, who really stepped up and expedited a lot of the processing of evidence. And certainly, as you now know, the Wayne County prosecutor did charge in one of our cases, not one that we talked about before, and I'll talk briefly about that. But the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office, under the leadership of Kim Worthy, really worked very closely with our investigators. In fact, several prosecutors were assigned to work literally around the clock so that we could quickly bring some closure. And then also the Wayne County Medical Examiner. I would tell you they work very cooperatively with us. Cases like this are not easy. You've heard me say last week, when you talk about victims whose bodies are in different states of being decomposed, very challenging to figure out cause of death. As I pointed out on one of our first victims, initially early on our detectives and the medical examiner thought, because of the location, that this was possibly a drug overdose. And then sometime later, I think it was May 20th, that there was a final ruling made that that victim did die as a result of forced trauma. So as we now know, and lastly, I must thank our community leaders and activists who, as you know, have been mobilized, tirelessly working to support us as we have made entry into a number of vacant dwellings. Just to kind of give you an update on where we are with that, I had a chance to go out on Saturday afternoon on one of the areas and watch our officers go into the locations prior to the board-ups. Very thorough work that's being done, very challenging work, I must say. The first day, 17 locations were boarded. On Saturday, 35, and we anticipate by end of today, 55. So we are pushing vigorously to board up as many of these vacant dwellings as possible. And so with that, as you know, we put out information on a person of interest. And within hours of putting that information out, our headquarters surveillance attached to our narcotics section was able to identify this suspect at a bus stop in the area, 7 Mile and Gratiot, of where the crimes were being committed, and he was arrested without incident. And since that time, as we continued, our investigation continued, he then became a suspect, and again, he has been charged in the non-fatal stabbing and sexual assault of a woman. This, of course, is not one of the three that we talked about. This is a surviving victim. This crime occurred on May 7th in the 19,000 block of Barlow. And in this instance, the one deviation from the pattern is that this victim was younger than the other victims. She's described only as a black female, 26 years old. And so we were able to find out about this as a result of putting this information out. And so he has been charged in that crime. There's yet another surviving victim that we're also interviewing. That crime took place on June 3rd. Ironically, that crime took place at the same location as what I reported last week, the third location on Mack Avenue. And so we're still moving forward with that investigation. So we believe, based on the work that's being done, that this suspect is tied into all of the crimes, and we'll have more information soon. So with that, I'll open it up for any questions you might have on this matter.
Last week you you said that the suspect here was targeting sex workers of older age. With this new finding or revelation that one of his victims were much younger, does it change the makeup of the older demographic that he was looking towards for victims or motive?
It does not. It does not change anything. In fact, as you know, we've identified the third victim from Friday. I reported out that she was 52. The first victim I talked about, who was the first victim that was identified in the medical examiner ruled that it was in fact a murder. She was 52, and then the second victim, 53. One of our surviving victims is also in their 50s. But again, this is the only anomaly in terms of age. And again, we are still very much involved in this investigation. We're hopeful we don't identify any other victims, but we're certainly going to continue to work very hard to see if there are any other victims out there. But these two victims fought, they survived, and we had an opportunity for putting this information out to meet with them and start an investigation concerning that.
Did they come forward, or was it a result of some of the community groups that were out there?
It was actually the result of us putting out this information very quickly, without going into a lot of detail. A family contacted us, and we followed up based on that. Now, I will tell you, when we talk about sex workers, generally they're not going to come forward. Many times, if they are attacked, they're not going to contact the police, because generally speaking, there's no real relationship. Many times the sex workers are marginalized. I was reading about a serial killer who for many years killed roughly 60 victims emanating out of the state of Ohio and around the country. And this killer also targeted sex workers. And so when you talk about someone who's marginalized, who's disconnected from family, who might be a drug abuser, those things make it less likely for them to come forward. And that is the challenge. I mean, there are many challenges when you're talking about a case like this. I talked about it last week, the fact that, vacant homes, sex worker, drug use, no connection with family, no witnesses. Those things really make our job very challenging. But I will tell you, I'm so encouraged by the way this community stood together to really assist us in eradicating this violent activity.
Chief Craig, a couple of questions for you.
Sure.
Do you still characterize all the victims at this time as sex workers, or are some of them addicted substance users? Secondly,
well, let's take one question at a time. So as it relates to sex workers, yes, the majority. In one instance, we have no indication she was a sex worker, but that she was involved in illegal narcotic use, an addict. And sometimes some of the sex workers have the dual distinction of sex working and also addicted to narcotics.
Is there enough evidence to charge him with murder at this time, or do we?
We're still working our case. We're confident that he is connected to all the cases that we've described.
And then lastly, how many victims do you expect there to be or believe there to be with the Angela murder?
Well, I think I'm reluctant to say there may be others, but right now with the two surviving victims and then the one that's already been determined as a homicide and the two that we anticipate will also be ruled as homicides. So right now we have a total of 5, 2 survivors and 3 deceased.
And Chief, given what you just said about the difficulties in having people come forward, are you surprised that you all were able to crack the case this quickly?
Well, I'm not surprised given the skill set of this department and certainly the dedication. I will tell you one thing that made this very different, despite what some critics might say, we came out very quickly when there was appeared to be a pattern emerging. We didn't wait for the medical examiner to rule on the second and third deceased persons. What we did We looked at patterns and similarities. As you heard me say last week, the signature, and it was through that signature that we believed that there was some connection. But again, we are still very much involved in this investigation, so I'm limited as to what I can say.
The 26-year-old victim that he went into the home and sexually assaulted, would you classify her as a sex worker?
At this point, the only information I have is that she was a narcotics user at this point.
And the woman who was assaulted on June 3rd, that other surviving victim, would you classify her as a...
It's information that she may also be a sex worker.
Okay, and is it the same MO, like he dragged her into a vacant?
Very similar MO, and I'll leave it at that.
Chief, are you investigating, well, a case involving a missing woman who was last seen with potentially this individual, the suspect, out in Ferguson?
Yes, we are.
Can you update us on where you stand with that?
We're very actively investigating that, and we're trying to confirm the identity. We still don't have an identity. She's a possible victim as well, but I'm not prepared to say that. So even though I'm talking about 3 and 2 survivors, it actually may be 4 and 2. But I'm not at a position to say that yet because we are waiting to identify that victim and some other.
What do you want to say to that family, though? We spoke to them over the weekend, and they expressed frustration that they had this dash cam video for so long. The report has his name as well as hers. Is there anything you'd like to say to the family about?
We're working very hard to bring some closure. We understand how important it is. I'll remind your viewers and listeners that we quickly, when we determined that there was a possibility of the same suspect that was involved in other crimes, we put it out even before we had a ruling on victim 2 and 3 that we talked about last week. Keep in mind, we didn't know cause of death. We only had cause of death on 1. But what drove us to where we had to get the information out, we specifically wanted to focus on the sex worker community. We did that because we knew in order to identify this suspect, we needed to touch that community, and we did that. And that's one of the things, when you look at how police departments approach, you talk about a serial killer and rapist, it's challenging because many times the police department does not have an in with the sex worker community. So it was important to make that distinction because we didn't want to create a lot of unnecessary fear. It was important to talk about the demographic in terms of age. So it allowed us to hone in on potential witnesses, people who would feed us information, but also encouraging those who were victims that did survive that would come forward. And as this case is continuing to open up, people that are in that trade are talking to us now, and they're talking to our community activists who are out on the ground. Yes, ma'am.
So in connecting all of these, is it, a different age on the 126-year-old, but is it just basically the same MO every single time?
Most likely same MO, some deviation. Again, we talk about serial killers that have a certain signature, and they don't always deviate from that, but that's not always the case. I remember the Grim Reaper in L.A. This spanned over 25 years in L.A. He focused on a certain demographic of sex workers, and then he went dark for 14 years. Someone who never came on our radar, someone who was an employee for the city of Los Angeles, once as a civilian an employee of the police department. He was also an employee with the city of L.A. in sanitation, so he didn't hit the radar. Even when we look at our suspect, he doesn't have a series of violent crimes in his history. And so, but again, we focused on the right community, the potential victims from that community, and that was the reason why I believe we were able to get information so quickly. Because if we hadn't gotten him as quickly, I think he would have struck again. And clearly when you look at the dates, we're talking about a June 3rd date, and this was after we put information out. And this is on a survivor. So what what if we had not arrested him? Would there be additional victims going forward?
Chief, real quick, talking about that potential 6 with the Ferndale case.
Yes.
You're waiting on identification. Does that mean that you have a body that might potentially be Deborah Reynolds?
There's a possibility. I cannot confirm it at this point. I cannot. But soon as we do, we will let you know. Certainly we want to let the family know. But at this point, we haven't made that confirmation.
But you
Do
do
you
have
have
a
any info-
body that's unidentified.
Yes, we do.
Is that the third, or is that in addition to the?
That would have been we talked about the 3 from last week. Then the Ferndale issue came up. That would be 4. We just haven't confirmed her identity.
So you have 4
But we
bodies.
do believe it's part of this series. We just don't know. I just can't confirm it as of yet.
So it's separate from the third victim that we spoke about?
Each victim, I mean, they're separate cases. The only thing that's common in one is one survivor and the Mac Avenues, the only thing they have in common, it was done at the same location. As I indicated, the majority of what we're looking at, these crimes took place on the east side. So we were right in thinking that this suspect was operating on the east side. He was arrested on the east side. The Ferndale is a bit different, but he ultimately ended up on the east side of Detroit.
Chief, on the Ferndale one, you said there were things that connected them that you're not at liberty to talk about.
Yes.
Was that body that might be her, was the same elements in that body?
I can't go into that right now, but as soon as we confirm the identity, we'll be in a better place.
That 4th body, was that found near that gas station where they were dropped off?
I'm not at liberty to go into that right now.
So there is a fourth body.
We believe so. Yes, sir.
No, sir. We haven't, her body we have not found. The 4th one, the Ferndale.
No, but we have a missing.
We have a missing, but we have not found her remains. I think they're confused. They think that we have her remains or some.
We're not certain. There is a missing,
Okay.
a reported missing, but that's the one. The Ferndale was reported missing out of Ferndale, so we're still very much, that's murky, and that's why I said potentially it could be yet another victim, but we have not confirmed it.
So when you say you're trying to confirm an identity, you're trying to
On the victim, because there's a victim reported missing out of Ferndale,
for nobody.
and I think that's what your colleague was asking, is whether or not we can say that, given that the family is admittedly frustrated, but we're not at the point where we can say that. We are still working this case, and there are a lot of unanswered issues that are emerging, and so we're going to continue to move forward. I'm sure in the next 48 to 72 hours we'll have more information and be able to confirm additional.
Is there any more information about the third victim that you could give us? I know at the time you mentioned it, the family had not been notified.
We did notify the family, and we have confirmed her identity. I don't know if we're prepared to release her name.
I'd rather.
I know, okay, she's 52. I'll just say that. I said it on Friday, but because we're not certain if every next of kin has been notified, but there has been a next of kin identification on that victim.
Is there any information, Chief, that the suspect had been arrested or approached by police, Detroit police, in that same area of Mac and Mount Elliott back in the fall?
Not that I'm aware of. He may have had police contact, but I'm not aware of it. Again, as I indicated, not much of a criminal history.
Chief, will the department be looking into cold cases that involve women on the east side?
We have and are doing that as well. We are looking for similar MOs. Certainly our law enforcement partners in other municipalities. We're working with anybody. So we have gone back and looked at other unsolved crimes, and we will continue to look.
Some possibly from Highland Park?
Neighboring jurisdiction, if there's a crime that fits the similarity, we would certainly be very interested in that, and certainly work with Highland Park if it's their homicide or missing. Any other questions?
There was nothing in his history that indicated so he's been kind of allegedly flying under the radar for some time, committing
what we know now, that doesn't mean he wasn't out engaging. That's why I use the example of the Grim Sleeper out of L.A. I mean, he was operating and had not much of a criminal history. And I'm not this one that had this being attributed to 60 homicides, rapes, and sex workers. I believe he, like many of the others, very little to. It's easy when you have someone. I mean, one of the first things we do when we are investigating a stranger rape case, many times we will want to know if someone in an area is on parole, probation for previous sexual assault. And so we do use that as a starting point. In this instance, there was nothing with this suspect. And then again, the challenge is when you talk about the sex worker community, they're not apt to cooperate and work closely with the police department. I don't care what city. And so that's why it was so important strategically to reach out to that community and encourage them to come in, work with us, so we could take this violent predator off the street.
How do you think he was able to get away with this for so long?
That's something you may have to ask him one day.
Chief, you said you had surveillance video of him, the suspect, on 7 Mile.
I'm not at liberty to go into the extent of that. We are looking at some video, but I don't want to go into the extent of video or any other evidence for that matter. So if it's any questions relative to evidence, I would rather not discuss that at this point.
Chief, one thing that I'm not sure if police, in my opinion, have been clarified yet. Were all the victims killed in the homes they were found at, to the best of your knowledge of the investigation?
We believe that those that were found were probably killed at that location.
Chief, can you talk about these two surviving victims? I mean, you've got a potential serial killer on the loose. You did allude to the fact that they fought real hard to get away from this guy, but I mean, it's just terrifying thinking this man allegedly could be capable of killing people. These two women survived.
What do you want to know?
Can you talk about just...
They fought in both cases. The only thing I will say, they fought and they live today.
Chief, are these two survivors cooperating with police?
They are. But again, in one instance, the one surviving victim was reluctant to come forward because of their own history. And again, we're talking about a community that does not talk to the police department. And so by getting out and encouraging the sex worker community to step up, that's why it was important to identify that community so that we could reach out and let that community know that we care about you, we want you safe, and as a result of that, that's when we started to get tips and information on where we needed to go.
Chief, were the two surviving victims, did they report to police, did they report to police more recently, or were some of these cases reported without a potential link to any suspect?
I don't want to get into our investigation. In fact, I've been somewhat generous as best I can. This is a very serious case, so know that there's still a process that he must go through, and so I'm very sensitive to that. So I would just ask, let's stay away from the actual investigation.
Do you have a message to the community just with the amount of resources that were deployed to this, catching this guy so quickly? Is there something you want folks in Detroit to know?
Everyone who lives, works, or plays in the city of Detroit, no matter what you do, we take crimes, violent crimes, very seriously. We understand that in many cities, a sex worker community is marginalized. They don't have access to the government. We want everyone to know, regardless, that we take these crimes seriously. We want to keep members of that community safe. And yes, it's a very high-risk and dangerous occupation. We all know that. And so as important is to know that we want to harden targets, those locations where violent crimes can be committed. It's no secret that we have an inordinate number of vacant homes that certainly are hotbeds for criminal activity, whether it's drug dealing, criminal sexual conduct. You know, we know that our children going to school in the morning sometimes have to walk past, you know, vacant dwellings. It's important for us to do everything we can to secure those locations. As it stands now, one of the things that this department does, we talk about safe routes to school. We fly our airship or air support over routes so that our children know that we are watching. And that's just one thing that we do. We recognize the dangers associated with abandoned homes that are not secured. And so that process is going to continue to move forward because it's important. And we're going to look at how we can expand it. The quicker we can secure these vacant homes, the better off we all will be as a city. But I tell you, I applaud the work that our neighborhood police officers have been doing over the last few days and moving forward and getting these, working with general services to get these homes boarded up. We are meeting, we have had some challenges, some of the homes you can imagine. One that I approached on Saturday, the top floor was burned out. So, I mean, how do you traverse a location like that that's very dangerous? And so we're trying to overcome that. Some of them have significant amounts of water in the basement. And so we're going to be working with the water department to drain water out of some of the residences.
Chief, if you're ready, if we could switch gears and
Yes.
talk about the violence over the weekend. Breakdown shooting and other.
We're still investigating that shooting. We believe there's a connection between the victim and the suspect. So we're still working through and asking for the public's help. When you look at the weekend shootings, we had 14 non-fatal shooting incidents. And here's kind of the analysis. 16 were argument-based. 1 had a narcotic next. 6 arguments. 1 narcotic. Of the 14, 7 were unknown. Of the fatal shootings, 1 was related to a domestic violence, 1 connected to a vehicle road rage, and of the 3 fatal shooting instances, 3 were arguments that occurred outside of bars. 1 bar, that's the one adjacent to Greektown Legends, and then there was a bar in the 11th precinct, Mandy's, and then 1 on the border of the 12th precinct and the 2nd precinct on 6 Mile called Sweet Soul Bistro. And so we're going to continue to pay close attention to these locations. One of the things that we're going to reinforce over the days coming is as these locations are letting out, we recognize that some have consumed alcohol, arguments start, and folks are not using good judgment. These disputes result in violence, and we can see when you talk about 3 locations, bars, where people have lost their life.
So 14 non-fatal and 3 fatal, correct?
Yes. In terms of our year-to-date, as of today's date, we're down 8 homicides as compared to this time last year. And as it relates to non-fatal shootings, we are up 3 with a 1% increase. Overall violent crime, we're down 4%. And so, as you can see, when you look at the analysis, too many people are becoming victims based on arguments, disputes that should not be resolved by using a handgun.
What would you say to folks who might be scared to come to Greektown right now?
I say, come enjoy the city. I was in Miami a few weeks ago at a Major City Chiefs conference. They have violence too, and I saw it. And that's not minimizing the violence that we've seen. Certainly we've read about the recent news reports in the city of Dallas, which typically is a quieter city than ours, 41 homicides over 1 month. And so we have lots of work to do. But some of it comes down to how you handle disputes. And so one of the things we're going to do, we're going to be highly mobilized and visible. One of the complaints that and I know the mayor's had the same complaint about individuals who are speeding, driving recklessly in our city. We know about the number of fatalities as a result of collisions, but what's amazing is that when we overlay crime patterns with traffic enforcement, it can have an impact on reducing crime. So we're going to continue to deploy that as a short-term strategy, certainly with the other things that we are doing.
So no one in custody on Great Town?
Not as of yet. But there is a connection between a victim and, we believe, a suspect.
Is there any connections that you're aware of between the Legend shooting and the Mandy shooting at this time?
No connection between any of the bars at this point. If someone has information that can help us, we'll take it, but we don't see a connection. It's just argument-based. Alcohol, you leave out, get in a dispute, and someone goes and gets a gun.
Chief, can you speak to one of the shooting incidents, Legends in particular downtown this weekend, and even listening to some of the scanners or whatnot, it seems that officers were well deployed, they responded quickly, they were able to, seems as if you were able to get make out of one of the vehicles, or perhaps, can you speak to those who are willing to fire a weapon, and your messaging on when to?
Well, again, I've said it before, and I say it again, there's a high probability that you will be caught. One of the things that we're starting to see more of, and these victims, I can't say for the suspect because the suspect has not been identified. You heard me several weeks ago when we had a shooting incident in downtown that the suspects were from the suburbs, Farmington Hills, to name one city. I think one was from Oak Park. Likewise, the victims in this shooting incident were all from the suburbs. Again, I can't speak to the suspect because we haven't identified him as yet.
So the 3 people killed outside bars are all?
Well, just in the one, we talk about Legends. I can't.
All the victims were from?
The information I have, yes.
Chief, you talk about disputes being the cause of much of this. Is any of that gang-related disputes?
One over the weekend we haven't confirmed that, may have a gang nexus, but what we're finding, gang-related disputes are much lower, and it might be because of the work we're doing with our ceasefire. We haven't seen much of that. These are disputes between older individuals, middle-aged individuals, who get in arguments and result to violence. We've seen that.
Do you have any information on the shooting on Stovall? I guess it involved a naked gunman.
Field Road, I think it was.
Do you know about that? Oh, this was it was a domestic violence situation. The suspect left the house, and but we know who the suspect is in that case. Yes.
Chief, in regards to Pride Festival,
Yes.
a lot of commentary, social and otherwise, the appearance of police officers seemingly escorting that protest of those neo-Nazis.
I'm glad that you raised that issue. First of all, our number one mission and goal is to keep the peace. Everyone has a right to free speech. You don't have a right to engage in unlawful conduct. I personally responded to the location because I knew that the information we had, that there was a possibility of the white supremacist group coming to the festival. And when I was told that they had arrived, that what they call the National Socialist Movement, 5 of their members who were in attendance were armed, 2 with long guns, and 3 with handguns. So they were open carrying, and what I'm told, it was their intent, at least through our intelligence sources, that they wanted a Charlottesville number 2. And as you may know, in Charlottesville, there was a major dispute between an opposing protest group that erupted into violence. We knew that we wanted to be properly staffed, which we were. When I arrived at the scene, there was a counter-protest group, some affiliated with the Antifa group, and some were patrons of the festival. We kept both groups separate. We had good communications with both groups, and as it turned out, there was no violence. And so for me, I applaud the Detroit Police Department once again for keeping lines of communication open. This could have been a bad situation had it erupted into violence. It did not. And so for any critics that would say we were escorting the National Socialist Movement, we were keeping two groups separate. And in doing so, we did walk at points with them to keep the opposing side away. We took no sides. We did exactly what we do in each and every one of these things. We established rapport with both groups, and we didn't have an uprising. Anything else? Well, again, thank you very much. Yes, ma'am.
I have one question, and that is, I'm Carolyn Norman from the Anti-Defamation League, and one of the questions I received from one of the people that inquired is it against the law to desecrate a piece of property if it's not yours, like a rainbow flag or an Israeli flag or something like that?
Well, that's a good question because there were some images where it appeared that one of the members of the National Socialist Movement was desecrating on the flag. That was not the case. There was some intent by a member of that group to set that flag on fire. We warned and advised that if you do so, you will be arrested. That did not happen. They did destroy the flag, and so, but in terms of an image where it appeared as if, that didn't happen. But they did destroy it.
Yeah.
They tore it, but
Their property, their property, I guess.
I don't know how they acquired it. We had one goal and one goal only, to keep the peace. We're talking about one group that was armed with handguns. We certainly didn't want the opposing group to assault them, thereby causing them to respond in a way that could have been very violent. Again, we view this as a success because nobody got hurt. And there was some very negative. I gotta applaud the men and women of the Detroit Police Department because both sides at different times referred to our officers using racial epithets, both the National Socialist Movement and also some of the members from the festival and Antifa. I don't know if they were all Antifa, but typically being masked up and referring to some of the African-American officers in the manner in which they were was totally inappropriate. But again, our officers are professional. We just wanted to make sure we maintain the peace.
Are you at liberty, Chief, to talk about a little bit of what they wanted to do to make this a new Charlottesville? What were they hoping to accomplish?
Well, they certainly had their attorney present. They had cameras. When we asked them to do certain things, they complied. But they were hoping, because of the open carry, they were frankly trying to bait this police department, trying to bait the other side, and the other side, the opposing protest group, was trying to bait our officers as well. And so both groups were wrong. They were both trying to, it didn't rise to the level that violence erupted, because if we had felt that violence was imminent, we probably would have made arrests. But at
When you
that,
say both groups, Chief, can you specify, because there were three?
well, they both were shouting racial epithets to each other, some towards our police officers. The socialist movement was making mocking noise consistent with that of a chimpanzee, directing it at certain African Americans to try to bait people into a violent encounter.